In my last video, I invited you to imagine a letter brought to you by the local estate agent. Reading it, you're sceptical because it says you've inherited a £2 million house. If true, it would be so good, but you don't want to fall for a scam. So you start to ponder, would the local estate agent risk trying to deceive me? Could the estate agent themselves be deceived? Didn't they do their homework? You'd start to invest further, I'm sure. Well, it's the same with Easter. If it's true, then it's so good. It's worth your while to look into it at least. But how would you do that? Where would you even start? Well, as a suggestion, what if we begin with the lowest common denominator? I mean with the facts that essentially all academic historians agree are historically indisputable. I'm not saying certain, but indisputable to be careful and accurate. Because we have no time machine to go back and observe for ourselves Pontius Pilate and Julius Caesar ever existing for certain, but we do have enough evidence for them to be historically undisputed by sensible people. And I suggest we do the same thing regarding the events of Easter to list the facts that are overwhelmingly regarded as indisputable. So first of all, let's start with this one. Jesus Christ died by crucifixion. Now, you might have heard of the swoon theory, that Jesus didn't actually die, he passed out and then naturally revived. But the historians don't think this holds up. The swoon theory goes on, not only did Jesus revive, but he regained enough strength to move away the massive circular stone that covered the tomb entrance that ordinarily required more than one person. He then overpowered the armed Roman guards, unless maybe they fell asleep and didn't notice a massive stone rolling past them. Or maybe he persuaded the guards to let him go free. But bear in mind, though, that in Roman society, if the prisoner escaped, then the guards themselves took the prisoner's place. So in this case, the guards would take the place of a crucified man. The guard would have been crucified themselves if a revived Jesus overpowered them or crept past them or was taken by the disciples. And there's no historic source suggesting that this is what happened. Perhaps his disciples overpowered the Roman guard, even though the sources report they were cowering away, hidden in a room full of fear, and then neglecting all their religious rules about decency, ignoring the common sense need for speed, they inexplicably removed all of the grave clothes and left them behind in the tomb in order to carry a naked Jesus somewhere to recover. Now, this suggested recoveries after crucifixion, and the Romans knew how to do that to the death. They checked by putting a spear into Jesus' side on the cross, and they observed, we're told, blood and water pouring out. If you want to check out the medical science of why this happens after death by crucifixion, then you can look into the gory details. But this is the first piece of evidence that's undisputed overwhelmingly by historians. Jesus died by crucifixion. Maybe we can imagine that written on the side of a building block, and any case explaining the events of Easter has to be built on this building block. What would the next building block say? The disciples believed they saw Jesus resurrected. It's not disputed that the disciples believed they saw Jesus resurrected. An old suggestion is that the disciples hallucinated, but this ignores what we know about hallucinations. They involve a misperception of one of the five senses. So most people, when they have a hallucination, apparently it involves the sense of hearing. They hear voices. A much smaller percentage involves the sense of sight, seeing something that isn't really there. Also, a hallucination has similarities to a dream. It's an individual thing. You can't invite someone into one of your dreams to experience what you're experiencing, apart from in that rather confusing film called Inception. Like dreams, hallucinations are an individual thing. People don't hear the same voice or see the same apparition as a person standing next to them. Now, the historical documents record several different occasions, often of more than one person, experiencing an apparition and appearance of what they believed was Jesus resurrected, and those extended over a period of 8 weeks. And these documents recording these things were written less than 20 years after Easter. One of them reads, Jesus appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, many of whom are still alive. Now that's important too, because it was written so early on, eyewitnesses of the event were still alive. It was possible back then to go and ask the eyewitnesses what did they believe they had seen. So there were multiple people observing the events, and the reports were written early on. And there's even more evidence about how convinced the disciples were. You don't have to have seen the Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, to know that Jesus was not the first or the last person to claim to have been the Messiah. Several others had arisen, and they also were crucified. And at that point, normally one of two things would happen. Either the followers of the wannabe Messiah would just disband, and that was that. Or what they'd do is they'd appoint a successor, and usually it was the next nearest relative, to carry on. So the disciple James, the brother of Jesus, would have been the obvious choice in this case. But something really different happened that had never happened before, and it needs explaining. Rather than disband or appoint a new Messiah, this time the group claimed that the Messiah had resurrected and they had seen him. And they continued to do this, and several of them were eventually martyred for their belief. People don't become martyrs dying rather than deny their faith unless they're utterly convinced their beliefs are true. And this idea of a resurrected Jesus is utterly new in Jewish thinking. They did have a belief in the resurrection of all people and at the end of time, but just an individual resurrection in the middle of history, that was a novelty, and it originates from these events. So brick number 2 would be labelled, the disciples believed they saw Jesus resurrected. Building a case of what happened at Easter has to account for both those bricks. And there's a third brick, overwhelmingly undisputed. Skeptics believed that they saw Jesus resurrected. This is different from brick 2, which was about people who were Jesus's followers, his disciples. This is about skeptics. And probably best known of those is the Apostle Paul, who turned from persecuting and murdering Christians because he believed that he'd seen and spoken with Jesus resurrected. He'd changed completely. Another interesting thing is that the skeptics didn't try a cover-up job. There's no record of anyone producing a body and saying, look, here you go, here's the corpse. And there's no historic source that denies the tomb being empty. Certainly the authorities wouldn't have just stood by helplessly watching the Christian movement gathering momentum in Jerusalem if in fact all along they could have quashed the whole thing with the evidence of a dead body. Let me give you this quote as a summary. It's from a historian called Paula Fredrickson of Princeton and Oxford Universities. Now, she can't be accused of being favourably biased since she's not a Christian herself. I'm assuming you know that we've all got bias, don't you? It's not just other people, it's also our own selves. Sometimes I wonder if people know that they've got their own bias, if they're aware of their own bias. Anyway, Paula Fredrickson writes, I know that in their own terms, what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know as a historian that they must have seen something. So that's what the historic evidence is. These are the facts that have to be explained. Jesus died by crucifixion, and the disciples and the skeptics were convinced they saw the resurrected Jesus. The swoon theory, the hallucination theory, the disciples stole the body theory, they don't fit with these undisputed historical facts. So what is it that really happened? Whatever you come up with, it's got to explain these bare minimum facts. Jesus died, and many people were convinced he resurrected. Now, it might be that you've never read a New Testament gospel for yourself and looked into it as historical writing, looked into the metaphors it uses to point to deeper truths, been introduced to the references and the allusions to backstories in the ancient literature of the Old Testament. Well, now in lockdown, this would be a really great time to start looking into it. I really think you should at least read just one of the Gospels to see for yourself. I'd love to read through John's Gospel with you, taking a chunk at a time and looking into it together. It's only got 21 very short chapters. It's about 30 pages. It doesn't take long to read. Please would you make a comment below if you'd like a copy of John's Gospel, either to read yourself, or you could read it through with me or Ben. We could meet up online or maybe ring each other about it. We're giving away copies for free. And the other thought I wanted to leave with you is to ask, But so what? Like with the imagined letter from the estate agent, what would you stand to gain if all this was true? I'm hoping I can do another short video, or maybe I'll even ask Ben to do one, that covers very briefly several of the major implications of the resurrection for us. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to leave a comment.